World War I was a war of many proportions, particularly on the field. However, how about back home? All countries participated in the art of propaganda, the act of spreading information which may or may not be misleading or even outright fabricated to convince the public of a political cause. This video will be split into separate sections, each focusing on a separate part of propaganda in the war. Something very important to note is that all the information from henceforth is to be taken with a grain of salt, as though it is from seemingly reliable sources. These sources could be propaganda themselves. They are known by me to be reliable, but there is a chance that I made a mistake. Now, without further ado, propaganda in World War I was used to fundraise, make the populace hate the enemy, and to get more people to enlist. Posters specifically did this by glorifying war and making a call to action for a specific cause. Propaganda relies on controlling the behavior of others, forcing them to act on emotional decisions rather than rational decisions. This is done through careful color, framing, and techniques that the public may not even notice. Think of the famous Uncle Sam Needs You poster. Look at the way he points at you, effectively forcing you to take action. Look at how he's dressed in very American colors, telling you that you'll be fighting for your countries. Other pieces of propaganda enticed men to enlist by reaffirming how brave, courageous, and sworn to their duty they would be if they fought in the war. It told them that they would also be able to protect their wives and children. Propaganda in World War I used traditional gender roles at the time to its advantage like this. Propaganda didn't influence those who helped in the manufacture of it, however. In 1917, the British journalist Lord Rothermere said once in a conversation to a colleague, quote-unquote, "We're telling lies. We know we're telling lies. We don't tell the public the truth, that we're losing more officers than the Germans, and that it's impossible to get through on the Western Front." End quote. Departments were created specifically for producing propaganda. Propaganda was used in the US by the Woodrow Wilson government through the Committee of Public Information, or CPI. This was a private department which created a lot of propaganda for the country, taking the form of films, posters, books, pamphlets, advertisements, and paid-of-mouth advertising. The CPI was disestablished after the war, but it influenced the US after. The US Office of War Information was developed in World War II with the same goal of producing propaganda. You've already been shown the Uncle Sam poster, but others, such as the Save Food posters, greatly influenced the US population for their causes. Britain, on the other hand, made propaganda to instigate hatred for the Germans, particularly by telling the public about Germany's war crimes. These could have been exaggerated or fabricated, but they worked to paint Germans as the enemy in the eyes of the British populace. Britain used these same tactics again in World War II. However, they didn't forget to up the morale of the public either. Propaganda came in various forms through World War I. From posters to cartoons, pamphlets, and even rallies. Propaganda took every form imaginable at the time. Well, aside from radio, as it was a relatively new technology. A prime example of a rally based around propaganda was in 1916 Melbourne, wherein the then Prime Minister of Australia, Billy Hughes, spoke that Australia should join the war effort. Statewide votes were held, and 887,367 voters of the 1,685,627 total voters in Melbourne voted against war conscription. There was also a lot of misinformation and disinformation being brought out by both sides. This was a tactic used to keep government secrets hidden and to paint the enemy as eviler than they initially would seem. Propaganda was developed through specialized government institutions, such as the previously talked about CPI in the US. One of these was the British Ministry of Information, or the BMI. They not only produced posters and such, but were also involved in spreading misinformation to the public, and censoring and banning movies through the British Board of Film Classification. These censors and bans could include things such as excessive violence, but could also be things such as depicting the British Army in a bad light. Italy in the war had quite an extreme approach to propaganda and censorship. The government took action to create patriotic propaganda, such as a 1915 book full of patriotic songs for the piano. They placed restrictions on the press, then restrictions on the soldiers, such as censoring the letters that they wrote home. The effectiveness of propaganda in World War I cannot be understated. It was an essential part of the war, one carried out by both sides. However, the Allied powers had stronger propaganda, which assisted in their victory. The propaganda put out by the Allied powers was focused on the people and morale. Germany focused on the military, which included gaining soldiers, resources, and such. The approach done by the Allies created a huge difference in how the general population responded to the war. The successful propaganda in World War I focused on morale. It kept the public going with hope as the war continued. Germany tried to employ propaganda only for military support, and that helped only in their loss. The takeaway from all this is that propaganda should be used only in occasions when it's needed. When it's used, it must be there for the sake of good. It's a naturally destructive and widespread tool, which also makes it an essential part of a country's arsenal in war, maybe even more so than the weapons.